3 minutes changed the emotional temperature inside the palace. Camilla had made what sounded like a simple request: replace the late Queen Elizabeth II's portrait in a prominent royal room with a new portrait reflecting the present reign. Charles listened without interruption. Then he gave an answer no one around them expected. No, not later, not after consultation, not as part of a redesign. The portrait of his mother would remain exactly where it was. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Charles closed the proposal folder and placed one hand flat across it, ending the discussion before either aide could speak. The room mattered because it hosted private royal meetings and official receptions, gatherings where the monarchy receives important guests. Its walls carried continuity. Elizabeth's portrait had remained there through the transition into her son's reign, meaning the period in which a monarch rules, becoming a bridge between the queen who died and the king who inherited her burden. Camilla knew palace rooms were already being reviewed to reflect the present monarchy, yet she had not expected this request to strike Charles like a wound. Camilla held her composure, but the refusal landed hard. She had asked for the late queen's portrait to be moved, not destroyed, and replaced in that room by an image representing the king and queen consort together. To her, it acknowledged the current chapter. To Charles, it reached beyond design. The crown, the institution and responsibilities carried by the sovereign, not merely the physical crown, had come to him because his mother died. Her portrait represented grief, inheritance, duty, and the moment loss became public obligation. He ordered that no alteration involving the painting happen without his personal written approval. Camilla finally broke the silence. "Is this about the room?" she asked quietly. "Or about me?" Charles did not answer at once. That pause cut deeper than anger. One aide lowered his eyes, because he already understood what she did not. This confrontation had begun weeks earlier, when a private remark about the same portrait unsettled the king more than anyone realized. Camilla watched him, waiting. Charles kept his hand on the folder and repeated that his mother's portrait would not be moved. The decision sounded final, but the emotion behind it was not. The story was never about one frame on one wall. It was about what Elizabeth meant to her son, what Camilla feared she could never become, and the hidden moment weeks earlier that turned a palace change into a deeply personal line Charles refused to cross. Camilla had spent years learning how to live beside royal history. Charles had spent his entire life living beneath it. Now one portrait had forced both truths into the same room. To the Queen, the proposed change represented the natural passage from one reign to another. To the King, it threatened to erase something deeply personal. Neither could surrender without admitting what they feared most, and neither wanted to say that fear aloud. Charles carried a grief few people around him could fully understand. Elizabeth had been his mother, but she had also been the sovereign, the reigning monarch whose death automatically passed the crown and its responsibilities to her heir. Her final days gave him almost no space to grieve privately before duty took control. Meetings followed mourning, ceremonies followed loss. The portrait became one quiet constant through that upheaval. Camilla understood the history, yet she also knew the monarchy could not remain emotionally frozen in the previous reign forever. She was standing beside the current king, carrying duties of her own, while every symbolic change risked being treated as an insult to the woman who came before. Camilla returned to the room after Charles had left. She stopped near Elizabeth's portrait and found a waiting courtier watching carefully for instructions. "Do not touch anything," she said. The words carried no anger, only restraint. Moments later, during a private exchange with the same aide, she clarified something that had been lost inside the confrontation. She had never asked for the portrait to be discarded. She had wanted it relocated with dignity, while a new image reflected the present reign. The distinction mattered deeply to her. Yet Charles had heard something else entirely: separation, removal, and perhaps even replacement in the emotional sense. Charles later spoke privately with William, and the future king immediately sensed there was more beneath his father's refusal. The monarch admitted that before difficult meetings, he sometimes looked toward his mother's portrait without speaking. It had become a ritual, a silent reminder of endurance he had never explained to anyone. William listened as his father finally revealed the deeper suspicion. "It is not simply where the portrait hangs," Charles said. "It is why the change suddenly became necessary." That sentence shifted everything. His pain was no longer only about memory. He believed the timing itself carried meaning. William chose his next words carefully. He remembered an earlier gathering, one that had seemed insignificant at the time. Camilla had spoken about the room's unfinished transition, and Charles had gone silent the moment she said it. The prince now understood that today's refusal had not begun today at all. The fracture had opened weeks earlier, quietly and almost invisibly, when one sentence changed the way the king understood his wife's intentions. And once William remembered that moment clearly, the next question became unavoidable. What exactly had Camilla said that night? And why had Charles never been able to forget it? The warning had come during a private family dinner, hidden inside one sentence that sounded harmless at first. No raised voices followed. No argument broke out. Yet Charles remembered every word. Camilla had looked toward the late queen's portrait, and said the room still seemed to belong to another reign. William noticed his father stop moving. Nobody challenged her. Nobody needed to. In that instant, an ordinary comment became the point of no return. Camilla had raised the subject while the family discussed refreshing several palace rooms before an upcoming royal reception. The idea itself was not unusual. Charles's reign was still defining its own identity, and updating rooms used for official gatherings was part of that transition. But Elizabeth's portrait was different. After his accession, the moment he became king following his mother's death, he had deliberately kept it in the same place. To him, that was not resistance to change. It was one emotional boundary he had never been willing to cross. Camilla tried to explain herself almost immediately. She said the reception room still belongs emotionally to the previous reign, and suggested that the central portrait should reflect the present monarchy. Then she noticed Charles's reaction. His hand tightened around his glass. His expression hardened. She insisted she meant continuity, not disrespect. But the clarification arrived too late. Catherine saw the change as clearly as William did. Later, in a private conversation, she told him that the king had looked less angry than wounded, as though one sentence had reached somewhere no one else in the room could see. Charles refused to confront Camilla that night. He finished the dinner, spoke when required, and let the subject die in public. Days later, however, the matter returned in a form he could not ignore. A preliminary room planning note reached palace staff with a suggested new location for Elizabeth's portrait. The phrase that stopped him was brutally simple: secondary corridor position. The king circled those words, set down his pen, and summoned his private secretary. He wanted to know who had authorized discussion of moving the portrait before he had given approval. William felt the danger immediately. This was no longer a disagreement over taste. It had become a question of trust. Charles learned that Camilla had intended to speak with him personally before anything changed, but the proposal had already moved through the household far beyond what she understood. That discovery made the situation worse, not better, because now the king could not tell where her suggestion ended and palace assumption began. By the time Camilla entered his private sitting room to explain herself, Charles was no longer asking whether his mother's portrait should move. He was asking whether his wife had allowed others to begin moving it before he had ever said yes. Charles did not summon a committee. Camilla did not bring an aide. The door closed behind them, and for once there was no machinery of monarchy between husband and wife. Charles placed the planning note on the table and asked one devastatingly simple question. Why had his mother's portrait already been assigned another location? Camilla stared at the page, then back at him. Her answer changed the confrontation completely. Camilla told him she had discussed possibilities with members of her household team, but discussion was not permission. She had expected nothing to move until Charles personally approved it. A household team, the staff responsible for supporting a senior royal's official and private duties, could prepare options, but it could not replace the king's final decision. That distinction mattered because the note had already circulated far enough to make the monarch believe the relocation carried real authority. To him, somebody had started acting as though his answer was merely a formality. Charles leaned toward the paper. "You should have come to me first." The words carried more hurt than anger. He was not talking about decoration anymore. He was talking about Elizabeth being shifted through palace paperwork, as though her place in his life could be reassigned by a planning note. Camilla's restraint finally broke. She reminded him that she had spent years choosing every word carefully, around memories she could never compete with. She respected his mother, she said, but she would not accept being treated as though wanting the present reign acknowledged meant trying to erase the previous queen. Camilla pushed the proposal back across the table. She then revealed, during that private conversation, that a senior courtier had transformed an informal discussion into a formal relocation suggestion without telling her how far the proposal had traveled. "Then tear it up," she told Charles. "If that is what you believe loyalty requires, tear it up yourself." The king looked down at the page but did not move. Finally, he admitted what had driven his immediate refusal. The words, "secondary corridor," had made him feel as though his mother were being quietly downgraded, not simply relocated. Charles's anger weakened under the weight of that confession. He told Camilla that there were still moments when he entered the room and, for one impossible second, expected Elizabeth to be somewhere beyond it. That admission changed her expression. She had been defending herself against accusation. Now she was hearing grief. But Charles did not destroy the proposal. Instead, he asked one colder question. Who had turned Camilla's private suggestion into an active palace plan? That question pulled the conflict away from husband and wife and toward the machinery surrounding them. Because someone inside the palace had pushed a sensitive idea forward before the king had ever given one. Charles could forgive a difficult conversation. What he could not ignore was a decision beginning to move without him. Within hours, the king demanded the chain of approvals connected to the portrait proposal. Names appeared. Notes were compared. Timings suddenly mattered. Yet amid the palace process stood one deeply human reality. Charles was not protecting a regulation. He was protecting the last daily reminder of the woman who had prepared him to reign. Charles ordered every note connected to the proposed relocation placed before him. The process mattered because changes to important royal rooms could involve household staff, curators, and private secretaries before reaching the sovereign for final approval. A curator, in simple terms, is the person responsible for caring for and arranging important royal objects and artworks. That structure made one informal suggestion capable of becoming official-looking paperwork very quickly. Camilla knew exactly how dangerous that now appeared. What she had believed was a discussion had begun to resemble an instruction issued in her name. Camilla received updates with growing discomfort. She feared the review would make her household look as though it had challenged Charles directly. And that fear cut deeper, because the disagreement was already personal. The queen consort had never wanted to be portrayed as competing with Elizabeth. Yet now the paper trail risked creating exactly that impression. Charles faced the opposite fear. By protecting his mother's portrait so fiercely, he could see that he might be sending his wife another message entirely. That no part of the current reign could ever stand beside the memory of the last one. Charles found the detail that changed everything. One planning note described the relocation as the preferred option, even though he had never been consulted. The word made the proposal look settled before the king had spoken. During a private meeting, the senior courtier responsible admitted that the team had assumed Camilla's preference represented the likely final direction and had tried to save time. Charles listened without interruption. Then he removed his glasses and placed them beside the papers. "Preference is not permission," he said quietly. Camilla later learned through a documented palace briefing that Charles had formally cleared her of authorizing the move. Relief should have followed. Instead, she felt exposed. A private suggestion had come dangerously close to becoming palace policy, without either of them fully understanding how far it had traveled. The king cancelled the proposed relocation immediately and ordered Elizabeth's portrait to remain untouched. But paperwork could not repair what the argument had done. Charles soon discovered that Camilla had made one decision of her own about the room. And this time, she had not asked anyone to prepare a proposal. The administrative question was settled in a sentence, but the personal wound was not, and Camilla's next move would show Charles just how deeply his refusal had landed. Camilla did not argue again. That was what unsettled Charles most. The next morning, she cancelled a planned private review of the reception room and told her staff that every proposal involving the late Queen's portrait was finished. No replacement, no relocation, no revised suggestion. Her words sounded obedient. Her expression did not. For the first time since the dispute began, Charles saw that winning the decision might have cost him something far more personal. Camilla ordered the matter closed completely. Elizabeth's portrait would remain in its established position, and no member of her household was to reopen the discussion. The senior courtier who had pushed the proposal too far was removed from decisions involving major symbolic changes while procedures were reviewed. A symbolic change, in this context, meant an alteration carrying emotional or historical meaning beyond simple decoration. The decision protected Charles's authority, but it also made the Queen Consort feel as though the entire episode had exposed an insecurity she had spent years trying to hide. Camilla went further than Charles had asked. She told her staff not to suggest any new portrait of her for that room at all. The instruction was quiet, almost clinical, but its meaning was unmistakable. She no longer wanted to compete for space there. In her mind, the refusal had confirmed something painful. There were parts of the king's emotional life that still belonged entirely to the past, and she could stand beside him without ever fully entering them. Charles, meanwhile, began regretting the harshness of his first response after learning she had never personally approved the secondary corridor placement. William saw the danger before his father admitted it. During a private conversation, the prince warned Charles that preserving the painting was one thing, but allowing silence to settle between husband and wife was another. "Silence becomes its own verdict," he told him. The words stayed with the king. He had defended Elizabeth's place exactly as he intended, yet he was beginning to understand that Camilla had heard something else in that defense, that there might be no equally secure place for her. Charles entered the reception room later that evening. Elizabeth's portrait remained untouched. For a moment, relief came first. Then he noticed the empty space where Camilla's redesign folder had been removed. That absence carried more weight than the paperwork itself. She had stepped away not only from the proposal, but from the argument entirely. Charles finally understood that procedure, authority, and royal instruction had reached their limit. If this wound was going to heal, he would have to speak without the protection of the crown. So the king stopped acting as sovereign and went looking for Camilla as her husband. And what passed between them next became the real turning point of the entire dispute. Charles found Camilla without aids, folders, or prepared language. This time, he did not begin with authority. He began with an admission. The portrait had become a private anchor after Elizabeth's death. something he looked toward on days when the weight of kingship felt almost unbearable. He had never told Camilla because even saying it sounded fragile. Now he understood that his silence had allowed grief to turn into accusation, and she had carried the blame for something she never intended. Charles told her the portrait had remained deliberately untouched after his accession because changing it felt different from changing furniture, fabrics, or the arrangement of other royal rooms. Accession, the moment an heir becomes monarch after the previous sovereign dies, had given him the crown at the exact moment he lost his mother. That collision of duty and grief never fully separated in his mind. Camilla listened as he admitted that preserving Elizabeth's place had become his way of preserving one fixed point in a life that had changed almost overnight. Camilla answered with equal care. She had never wanted to diminish Elizabeth. She had seen the reception room as a symbol of the current reign, and believed updating it could acknowledge the present without attacking the past. What hurt, she admitted during their private conversation, was the speed of Charles's judgment. His refusal had made her feel that simply asking for space beside royal memory would always be interpreted as disrespect. She had spent years trying not to compete with women, histories and expectations she could never replace. This time, she had feared the same old shadow had simply taken another form. Charles did not defend himself. He apologized. Grief, he said, had made him react as a son before he responded as a husband. He had never intended to replace Elizabeth emotionally, but he had also never intended Camilla to believe she needed to disappear beside her. That admission softened something between them. Camilla then offered the solution neither of them had considered. Elizabeth's portrait would remain exactly where it was. No relocation, no downgrade. Instead, another important room would receive a new portrait representing Charles and Camilla's reign together. The present would have its place without taking anything from the past. Charles reached across the table and took her hand. "That is what I should have heard before I said no." Camilla's anger eased, but she asked for one thing in return. The household had to understand that her withdrawal was not defeat. Charles agreed. Their private battle had finally found a compromise, but outside those walls the story had already acquired a harsher meaning, and the public was about to choose sides. By morning, a private disagreement had become a national symbol. The question was no longer whether one portrait should move. It was whether Britain believed its late queen should remain physically central to the reign that followed her, and whether Camilla had the right to ask for change at all. Headlines hardened the conflict into winners and losers. Yet behind palace walls, Charles and Camilla knew something the public did not. They had already reached a different conclusion. Charles understood why the reaction was so intense. Elizabeth had become a symbol of stability across generations, while his own reign carried the harder task of honoring that legacy without appearing trapped inside it. Palace staff prepared a carefully worded internal position stating that her portrait would remain in place, while future displays representing the current monarchy could be considered elsewhere. That mattered, because the dispute was no longer being treated as decoration. It had become a public argument about continuity, the idea that the monarchy survives by carrying its history forward, rather than starting again with every sovereign. Camilla felt the coverage cut deeper than she expected. Her original suggestion had been reduced to one brutal interpretation, that she wanted Elizabeth removed. That was exactly the accusation she had feared from the beginning. Charles saw the damage and refused to let affection for his mother become a weapon against his wife. He personally approved wording, making clear that the late queen's portrait remained by his decision, while other parts of the palace would still evolve to reflect the present reign. He did not reverse himself, but neither did he leave Camilla exposed. The pressure sharpened when the palace chose not to release the internal planning papers. Charles knew the premature secondary corridor wording could easily be mistaken for an instruction from Camilla rather than a proposal advanced without final approval. Outside Buckingham Palace, A small crowd gathered as evening broadcasters led with the dispute. One newspaper carried Elizabeth's image beneath two enormous words, "She stays." In an instant, the portrait became something larger than the room itself, a national symbol of memory refusing to disappear. Camilla saw that front page at breakfast. She placed it face down and stayed silent. Charles looked at her and said only, "They do not know the whole conversation." She understood what he meant. The public had chosen a winner, but husband and wife had already rejected that version of the story. The world had declared the portrait a victory for the past, but Charles knew the final verdict had to protect something harder: his mother's memory, his wife's dignity, and the monarchy that had to carry both forward. In the end, Charles did not reverse his decision. Elizabeth's portrait stayed. Camilla did not renew her request. Yet neither outcome meant what the first explosive hours had suggested. The late queen had not defeated the current queen, and Camilla had not tried to erase the woman who shaped Charles's life. The crisis forced the king to confront something far more difficult. A monarchy cannot honor its dead by humiliating the living, nor embrace the present by removing its past. Charles issued the final internal instruction, with no room for confusion. Elizabeth's portrait would remain permanently in its established position for the duration of his reign. At the same time, another prominent royal setting would receive a formal portrait representing Charles and Camilla together. A formal royal portrait, an officially approved image used to represent members of the monarchy, could acknowledge the current reign without displacing the previous one. That decision mattered, because the argument had never been only about decoration. It was about whether memory and change could exist without one destroying the other. Charles later spoke to Camilla privately and admitted something he had resisted from the beginning. His first refusal had come from grief as much as judgment. He apologized for allowing that grief to make him suspicious of her motives. Camilla accepted the apology and acknowledged that Elizabeth's portrait occupied a place in his emotional life she could never replace. The king answered with equal clarity. She did not need to replace his mother in order to matter beside him. That was the truth both of them had spent days struggling to say. Charles then ordered that future proposals, involving deeply personal royal memorials, require direct family consultation before becoming formal household recommendations. William later saw the unchanged portrait plan beside the newly approved proposal for the current reign. The prince understood immediately what his father had done. He had protected history without allowing history to freeze everything that followed. Charles and Camilla entered the room together before a private reception. He paused briefly before Elizabeth's portrait. She did not step back. She did not lower herself beneath the memory hanging over the room. Charles offered his arm, and Camilla took it. That simple moment became the real verdict. The refusal was not Camilla's humiliation, and it was not Charles's victory. It was the moment the king learned that protecting his mother's memory did not require keeping his wife permanently in her shadow. Elizabeth's portrait remained exactly where Charles needed it to be. Camilla remained exactly where the present reign required her to stand, beside him, not in competition with the woman who came before. Memory was protected, dignity was restored, and the monarchy moved forward without erasing what made it possible. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.